Hi, welcome to another one of my videos on Alteryx. This video has involved a lot more preparation work than most of my videos, mainly because we've stepped into a new level of complexity and solved a problem that I've had in the past, but I've never solved with Alteryx. I've seen on the Alteryx community a number of questions about hierarchies, and so I decided to solve it once and for all, which was an awesomely nice journey, and I will share the results of that journey with you. We will be looking at a couple of macros that enable us to extract information from a hierarchy, and it involves creating and utilizing an interactive macro as well as a setup macro in front of it. If you would like to see the actual source of these workflows, please subscribe to my channel, drop me a comment, and I will move the macros to a location in my share drive that you can access and post that information in the comments as well. So let's talk about hierarchies and why they present such a unique challenge and why I have avoided hierarchies and resolving hierarchies within Alteryx until now. So first of all, the reason why hierarchies present a problem is that number one, if you're getting the raw data of a hierarchy and not something that's already turned into a flattened hierarchy, the data that you're looking at is not relational data. It's not flat data. It is much more complex than that. To a degree, it's easy to create the hierarchy and very hard to resolve the hierarchy. So you're probably familiar with a number of different versions of hierarchies. And one thing to keep in mind is that from a history standpoint, before there were relational databases, there were hierarchy databases. And everybody built hierarchical databases and decided to squeeze their relational data into hierarchies. And then once we got into a relational world, they started squeezing hierarchies into relational databases. So let's look at some of those hierarchies. You're familiar with the basic hierarchy, which is an organization chart. And again, within a hierarchical database, what you do is you create the relationships and you keep information about the levels that you're going through within the relationships. And a hierarchical database allows you to easily navigate up and down a hierarchy and find the parents and children pretty quickly. There's also the family tree, which is to a degree, can be considered an upside down org chart. But again, the relationships that you're concerned about are now multiple relationships running between parents and children as opposed to some mostly single relationships going from children to parents. And then we have the network diagram. While my people don't consider this to be a hierarchy, it is a hierarchy turned on its side. In a network, you typically have inputs, pathways, and an outbound part of traffic. It's very useful for data configurations within networks, data centers, etc. But again, what you're concerned about in a network diagram is the pathway that you take through here and what different nodes and equipment are at those nodes that get you from the beginning to the end. And finally, within a business world, there are what's considered the sales region hierarchies. Typically, these are small and are presented in a flattened basis. But what you deal with here is you have countries, you have states, you have counties, you have regions, and you have salesmen. So you have this information that you would like to use for your roll-ups. And again, a lot of times these are small enough that they're generated by the sales department and maintained within a data warehouse. But what we want to look at is to go ahead and be able to pull this out of the raw data as opposed to being handed the hierarchy and be able to do so in a more dynamic fashion. Before Alteryx came along, and when databases finally get a little bit more sophisticated, we are able to create what's called recursive SQL. And what this SQL does is it takes a SQL that queries within itself in order to run through your hierarchies. So here within an Employee Manager SQL, we create a recursive view of data that selects both from the employee table itself, joins to the employee table, and then also deals with working within the recursive query as well. So data from the previous part of this query gets joined back in, union back into the join that the next step takes on, and it rotates through there. It is a very advanced version of SQL, and one that I've used to deal with a number of these different structures and have never actually converted to Alteryx. Alteryx has a vehicle that you can utilize to do recursive or hierarchical queries, and they call it an iterative macro. And again, iterative is just a different word for recursive, because what iterative means is that it continues to query going forward with the existing data until it runs out of data to query and returns you everything that it found along the way. Again, this, as you can see, is a very advanced topic. There is a Alteryx class on their website going through their university that will talk to you and they show you how to build a very basic iterative macro. But it's at the end of the food chain. Don't head into iterative macros until you're very comfortable with advanced workflows. And by this I mean workflows that separate data, join data, and perform some other advanced steps. You also have to be comfortable with macros, because an iterative macro is based on the macro functionality. And so I won't jump into my first macro being an iterative macro, but if you're comfortable building the macros, understanding input data and output data that flows into a macro, then it's time to go ahead and head into your iterative macro if you want to solve the hierarchies. That being said, what this video is going to talk about is not so much about the iterative macros, because they are fairly simple, and the information, I mean, they're very simple from a definition standpoint, harder to build. And the interactive class that Alteryx has, and I'll show you the results of that class, is pretty simple and straightforward, very short and straightforward. But then building a hierarchy walker that will satisfy all the different hierarchies became a much more complex task, and I'll simply show you those macros that I created to make this work so you can begin to see where you are going. We'll start out with very simply showing you an iterative macro picture, which is this. That is the Alteryx penny interactive macro that has to do from the class. It takes and accumulates a penny being doubled every day for how many days you want to go through. As you can see, from a macro standpoint, it is quite simple. It has 2 outputs and 1 input, but the important part of this is within the definition of the properties of this macro, you are creating a loop between this loop output and this money input that came along originally. So the data from here is circled back. You have a where clause that stops it. We'll run this at the very beginning of this video as I talk about the iterative macros that I created. I created 2 test sets. One is a network where I have 2 inbound nodes that pass through the network and end up at one of 3 outbound nodes. And I want to be able to see how to get from my input to my output and what nodes are along the way and how many different paths there are. This is walking the hierarchy from left to right as opposed to top to bottom, but it's still a hierarchy. I also then created a test tree. This is more of a family tree. We have a single parent that has 3 children. This first child has a great-grandchild, a great-great-grandchild, and a great-great-great-grandchild, just to show you the levels going through. The third child does not have any children, and the second child has a great-grandchild, and that great-grandchild has 2 great-great-grandchildren. So this shows you some of the flavors that you would generate within a hierarchy going top to bottom that you want to peruse. And when we look at the hierarchy, we're not so much concerned as to how to start and end, but the interconnections and the accumulated data between the stepping down, as well as looking at any position and seeing what comes below it. So unlike a network, you're also concerned about what occurs in the middle. If you think about this as the CEO, the directors, or the vice presidents, and the directors, and then the people that work for them, you get the idea as to how this would need to be presented out. So take a brief moment, possibly longer than that, to talk about iterative macros. First of all, it is a macro. If you follow along and build the penny iterative macro from the Alteryx class, you'll end up with a macro that looks a lot like this, and then a workflow that looks like this. A few things about iterative macros. As they pointed out in the class, you must select a macro to become iterative once you have built it, or while you are building it. It doesn't automatically become an iterative macro unless you tell it that it is. A few things that I discovered while working with them. Number one is that you must have an input, which is actually a macro input. Click on interface up here, and you see you must have macro input. Input must come into your iterative macro. And that is the only parts of a standard macro that you're allowed to use. You cannot have parameters come into it, because that turns it back from being an iterative macro back to a batch macro. That restricts you to a degree if you need additional information in order to perform the iterations. And we'll see how I overcame this with my hierarchy and network iterative macro. The second thing is that you must have at least one output that gets cycled back into the input. And then, since you're trying to see the work that gets done, you will need a second output as well. So make sure you manage both of these outputs. In class, they didn't talk about labeling them with an anchor, but I did, so that when I created my workflow to use the macro, I knew which was the looping output and which was the final output. But you're not limited just to that piece of work. There's other things that you can do as well, depending upon what you want your macro to do and how you want to see the output from that macro. Everything that occurs between the input and the looping output is your development workflow. And don't forget that you're allowed to split and join the data flows along the way. A simple thing that I think they might have talked about, but I like to see from this macro, is that when I run it, all I get is the single output, what it is at 30 days. It'd be nice to see what it was each day. This is very useful as well as important and necessary when I'm doing my hierarchy work in order to resolve the stepping through one level at a time to come up with all of the nodes that are linked to the beginning of each of the units. So to show you what I mean by that very quickly, what I will do is in the join add a union, and I'll take this false and also feed into the union. So what tell this macro to do is that whether it's true or false, when it's true, we will finish and send that last record across. But if it is false, we will send the intermediary record through and then loop back to get another record. So every record that is processed by this iteration goes into the output, so that way you can see what is happening. So to run that and give you a view of it, we need to save this. Click on my controlling workflow, update it with the new version of the macro, and then run it. And then you can see here that I now know each day what the penny became, which is a more useful information and more analytical than just giving you the final answer, because now you can do what you want with this piece of work. and the results can be applied and reported as you need be. Sorry for the sudden jump in screens there, but I've been working on the best methodology to explain to you and to present to you the hierarchy macro and how to use it without making your eyes roll back from too much detail. It will be a lot to absorb. I recommend that you begin your own pathway into iterative macros with your own use case, being aware that you need to build it slowly and incrementally and adjust, which is what I had to do over the course of the last week to get this completed. So bear with me as I just give you the highlights of what this macros does and how I control it and use it, and it helps highlight some of the limitations of an iterative macro. So here we have my network data. I run it through my macro, and I get out of it this very nice mapping of this network. It has all of the nodes that are parents, steps you through one level at a time from each of those parents until you finally come to the very end of the network with the outputs. With this information, I can build a second data set, or to reduce this data set, or use this data set in its entirety to do some analytics. It is not the end result of this process, but it is a necessary step in the middle to let me see how the network works so that I can do my analytics, such as finding the shortest route, the number of routes, etc. If I disconnect this link and I reconnect this link into it here, I must go into it and check my parent field and my child field. This is the node data. That is the parents and child. I've got one president, 3 CEOs, and a whole bunch of workers underneath there. And when I run that through, I get out of it this kind of information as well. It shows me everybody that works leading up to the president and what level they are at. It shows each manager and everyone that works for each manager, as well as what level they are at as well. So again, this gives me analytics so I can find out how many managers I have, how many people each manager has, all this information. I also can chart the hierarchy at any level and produce that for reporting as well. How did I get here? Well, it was a two-step operations. Let's take a look at my iterative macro so you can understand basically how this has to work. In the development of this, it started out as a normal workflow to where what I did is I took the looping output, saved it as a text file, and passed it back into the process so that I could monitor how it worked, where things were going wrong, correct them, start all over again, and continue through it. The limitation that I ran into when trying to turn this into an iterative macro is that I can only have one input. I needed all of the data as well as each of the parent nodes that would be analyzed to see who their children were and pass through here. So my looping is the parent nodes. I also needed to know who started the node as a separate data point, as well as being able to go. So if you look at my data that I edit, what I needed to start with is the root. And then incrementally, I'll be finding new parents, new levels, and a new path. So I needed to pass in the initial data to do this work with. And then at each level, what I do is I compare that level's parent nodes to the overall network. What I had to do to get this to work is that my input stream is the initial parents, priming the process. And then I had to bring in a data file that has all of the network pairs. That being said, it's very easy to go ahead and join the parents to the network to find out who their children are by simply looking at a parent node to the inbound node. Look at this data is inbound and outbound. I did this name change within this data file so I could try to keep track of what I was working with. So basically I joined these two together. That gives me all of the connected nodes to the current parent node, which is different than the root node. I then use a formula to go ahead and extend out the path and add to the level. Once I have that information, I join it back again to where the inbound node equals the outbound node, because this will get me the next step in the process. So essentially, this is the step that I am concerned about. This one becomes the next step in the process. What I do now is again split this out. The right-hand side of this join is any node path that I've created. This is a parent to child that does not have an additional child going on to the next step. So in other words, I have reached a terminus of this branch or path. In that case, then I simply want to clean up the data that I use and pass it back in as my output. The join is where the process will continue on. In other words, the node that I just looked at, parent to child, has another child below it, and so it needs to continue into my navigation. But don't forget that I also want to track each of the steps. So anything that is joined is passed to another select where I clean up that data and again pass it through to my output. So I get the final result from any path as well as each step along the way. Once I have done that, I also need to take this new step and pass it back into the process. And so I do that by creating a unique set of nodes that are going to continue forward. Clean up that data as well, and then pass it into the looping output. The looping output then becomes the input into this process, and we do it all over again. If I look at how to connect the looping output to the looping input, you do that within the interface designer view. And you identify the iteration input and the iteration output so they're connected. I set the maximum to 100 iterations so that if I run into some kind of recursive loop inside of this, it will stop. I was worried about performance of this overall process, but it turns out by doing it this way, I've only ever read in this data one time. It holds it in an internal cache, and then each individual level is dealt with as a unit as opposed to a single path being passed through it to be analyzed one at a time. So it is doing the group logic of processing a level at a time, becoming very efficient to run through it. Again, subscribe, leave me comments. I can follow up on more details about this if you have more to ask with. Now, obviously, I need to have a standard input as a file and a standard input as the first level of nodes. And this is where you can control what kind of information that you want to see coming out of it. So I created a hierarchy analysis control program. This simply receives input from a workflow, which is what the test program does. It sends the input into the control macro. Control macro cleans up the data. I now have a crew macro for the parallel block until done. It's my most consistently available and performant blocking because I need to write out this data before I actually jump into the macro that does the work. Having written out the data, I then determine what data I want to set as the primary data. In this case, it's all of the unique roots. Which root came from the parents. So I take all the unique roots, everybody that is a parent. I create these additional fields of parent, level, and path to start this process. And I pass it into my walker macro. And then this gives me the node output I need, which is returned back to the test workflow. In this test workflow, I also have the loop to show whether or not anything was non-completed, and the answer is that everything was completed. So this gives me a full analysis. You can customize your own control macro as far as what it does in the middle to go to your macro. So for example, this analyzes every parent if that's too unwieldy, and I need to limit that to just inbound nodes because I don't care about the steps in between. I can go ahead and create a control macro that does exactly that. So if I go into File, Open Recent, I have my network analysis control macro that I created as well. Because in this case, it still takes and creates the data file to go into my walker macro. But now rather than send all of the parents, it finds only those parents that do not, only those nodes that do not have another parent. And I do that by joining the inbound node to the outbound node. Anything on the left are those nodes that do not have a parent. And then I cleanse that data and send it through as my starting point. And then this gives me a reduced look at the data as well as reduced output if you're only concerned about the inbound to outbound pathways and not the internal pathways. So again, customizing what you do within this type of control macro will better define how you walk through the hierarchy, but it doesn't affect and does not require a change in the walker itself. And then finally, whatever you want to do once the data is returned to you, as far as post-processing, you can do things like rows or columns transformation, such as a transpose, crosstab, parsing text to columns, etc. can all be used in this network path to glean additional information in a flat version for you. You can also do counts, etc. according to this data or limit the data that you see within it. But basically, the hierarchy path walker is designed to return to you all of the data so that then you can post-process the information so that you can do your reporting. In quick summary, hierarchies are complex. The macros to analyze them are equally complex. Iterative macros is something that you may need to learn to do within your job, but don't start out with iterative macros. They are advanced. Work your way up to it. Be careful while you're developing them. I hope this video gives you some answers. If you need to see more details, please leave me a comment, and I will look at how to get some more details to you to help you in your exploration of data. Have a great day.